Thank you all for being here for this event titled Human Rights, Security, and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. My name is Phil Dalton. I'm the director of the Center for Civic Engagement and a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy here at Hofstra. This is the Center for Civic Engagement's 18th year. Our mission is to offer educational, co-curricular, and cultural programs and activities that foster an awareness of local, national, and global issues, encouraging students to be active citizens and contributors to their local, national, and global communities. We're supported by over 30 faculty and administrators who make up our advisory board, 16 undergraduate fellows who learn by working alongside community partners here on Long Island, and 2 graduate assistants who help make everything we do possible. And if you wish to learn more, there are these freshly minted cards in the back, informational cards. Maybe you want to be a fellow with the center. So please grab one of those on your way out if you'd like. This is our Day of Dialogue. The Day of Dialogue at Hofstra was begun by a now retired sociology professor, Cindy Bogart, who's now an author, retired up in Vermont, doing great work. The day exists as a way to get students and the community talking and listening to one another about the issues of the day. And some people are good at talking, and some are less confident doing so, but far fewer, it seems, are very good at listening. And that's really at the core of what this day is about, providing opportunities for different voices to be expressed and for us to give careful consideration to what we hear. And if we do it right, you will hear things you disagree with. And proceeding from that assumption, however, that other people are equals, people we disagree with are equals, we hear them out, we listen, and we learn in the process. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words of thanks first, before she leaves the room. The Cultural Center, specifically the work of Athleen Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi. Without their effort and their expertise here, this event could not come together. The Center for Civic Engagement's undergraduate fellows and our graduate assistants, namely Alexa Sauter and Eliza Ortega, they help put together and market these events. And finally, little of what we do here at Hofstra would be possible without the support of Provost Charlie Reardon. Today's discussion about human rights and security and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was largely conceived of by Dr. Rusty Eisenberg of Hofstra's History Department. Foreign policy considerations are at the forefront of this presidential election. And as the shape of this event was considered, efforts were made to include the voice of support for Israel's current foreign policy. And while we did not find an alternative perspective to share the stage today, we do ask that as members of the audience, you share your points of view if you have a different perspective to share. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Linda Longmire, Professor of Global Studies and Geography. Dr. Longmire teaches courses in Global Studies, Human Rights, and Women's Studies. She's the founding member one of the founding members of Hofstra's Institute for Peace Studies, and she runs our annual summer abroad program titled Paths to Peace. And again, that's information about that is on the card in the back. So now join me in welcoming Dr. Longmire.
Thanks so much to all of you for being here. I think we all know in almost every religious tradition there is some version of the statement that without a vision, people perish. And has there ever been, of course there has been, but other moments in history where a vision of peace, a vision of resolution of the terrible conflicts going on in the Middle East, well, it's never been greater. And so I've been, as we all are, thinking about this and about as people, agonize over the situation. And I go back to a wonderful essay that many of you know by Albert Camus, the existentialist philosopher, called Neither Victims Nor Executioners Be. And so I wanted to just begin our program before we welcome our guests today and open things up for respectful, thoughtful, we hope visionary dialogue with this quote from Camus, which is part of Neither Victims Nor Executioners Be. He says, and obviously this is in the context of World War II and the horrors that were going on, he says, all that I ask is that in the midst of a murderous world, we agree to reflect on murder and make a choice. After that, we can distinguish those who accept the consequence of being murderers themselves or the accomplices of murderers, and those who refuse to do so with all their force and being. Since this terrible dividing line does actually exist, it will be a gain if it's clearly marked. Over the expanse of 5 continents, throughout the coming years, an endless struggle seems to be going on and to be pursued between violence and friendly persuasion. A struggle in which, granted, the former, the violence, has 1,000 times greater chance of success rather than the latter, the friendly persuasion. But I've always held that if he who bases his hopes on human nature is a fool, he who gives up in the face of circumstances is a coward. And henceforth, the only honorable course will be to stake everything on a formidable gamble that words are ultimately more powerful than munitions. I hope that doesn't sound naive, but it's a very powerful statement as we search for peace in the Middle East and throughout the world, in Ukraine, in Sudan, etc. So I'm really delighted to welcome a man of words, a man of vision, and a man of action to speak with us today about the Middle East, about what's going on in the Middle East. And we're so delighted that David Wildman is here to share not only his insights, his words, his visions, but also his actions with us. He's the Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with the United Methodist Church, the General Board of Global Ministries. He works on behalf of that board, but in partnership with grassroots organizations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, both of which he visits regularly. So he knows of what he speaks directly. And again, it is a long biography, but he's persuaded me that it must be short. So from 1989 to 2001, he also facilitated peace and justice seminars at the Church Center for the UN. Some of you may, if you've been involved in NGO work with human rights, are familiar with that center. He helped found United for Peace and Justice in October, going all the way back to 2002, and the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation in 2001. And he serves on its steering committee still. He also serves on the World Council of Churches, Palestine, Israel, Ecumenical Forum, the core group. David holds both a Master of Divinity and a Master of Philosophy in Social Ethics from Union Theological Seminary. Many of you know its important work throughout the world as well as here in New York. So please join me in welcoming David Wildman. We're so grateful that you're here to help guide us through what is a painful but urgent and important dialogue. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I've actually had the privilege of being a part of these days of dialogue in the past, though I think it was 9 or 10 years ago, some discussions on Afghanistan. I co-authored a book on ending the U.S. war in Afghanistan in 2009. It sadly took a little while to get that point, and Afghanistan is still like a mess. But today I want to talk about the work of the United Nations and particularly how it relates to Palestine and Israel and what's been going on, especially in the last year. I want most of our time to be that dialogue, so I'm going to try and kind of do a little overview for 25 minutes and touch on different things, but really welcome brief comments, questions, so we can have a back and forth. And I want to just say that this day of dialogue is very much in keeping with the principles that led to the founding of the United Nations. That after the horrors of World War II, people came together, even in the midst of that. In June of 1945, there was the Charter Convention out in San Francisco. And then it was this month, in October, the 24th, was the official founding and launch of this new multilateral organization that was founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to work for economic and social development and for equal rights of all peoples. How well it's done, we'll see. But the idea was that we should set up tables where those that are enemies and deeply divided can gather around one another. And in my over 35 years of work with the United Nations, I'm right across the street. And one of the great things is I can leave the country every day without a passport for lunch, and for me, because the UN is international territory. So please come to New York, and I'd encourage you to visit the UN. It's a little harder to get into these days, but you can still, it's open to the public to visit. But I want to affirm that notion of that throughout this last year of what's happened in Gaza, what's happened in Israel and Palestine, and now in Lebanon. At the UN, the different parties that have been a part of this conflict have been sitting down and forced to listen to one another and also had an opportunity to speak. So the ambassador from Israel and the ambassador from Palestine, each, when there's a gathering of the UN, the Security Council, the General Assembly, each are offered a moment that they are able to address the body and, parenthetically, one another. And whatever conflict there's been in the world, that's largely been true. That for many, many years around, think of all the different conflicts, that the parties would be invited to gather. It's state parties, so there is an issue of non-state actors and liberation movements, resistance movements, terror groups, etc. So I want to just say that this dialogue, we should affirm this whole approach, even if it's not easy and it's uncomfortable. So I want to just give a little background of myself in relation to the region. I'm the regional secretary that relates to the Middle East, to our partners there. So that's human rights organizations, direct service organizations, churches, the United Methodist Church. So our primary partners are Palestinian Christians. Those are the folks that we relate to, and I visit regularly. And as part of that work, in October of 2022, 1 year before the escalation of violence that happened October 7th last year, I was in Gaza visiting a mother-child health clinic, visiting vocational training programs, visiting 2 of the churches that are there. It's a very small Christian community, visiting a hospital and other places. Every single place that I visited in October of 2022 has been badly damaged or destroyed. 100% of the people that I met have been displaced. Some have been killed. So the impact on the people of Gaza is unimaginable. And I think many of you have followed this closely or not, but the images are just horrific. The stories are horrific. And so I share that to say that there was life. When I was there 2 years ago, we visited a mother-child health clinic, and 25% of the children under 5, a year before the escalation, were suffering from anemia, were undernourished, and not getting adequate supplies, and they had a mother-child health clinic to go to. Now there's been a year of multiple displacements, and most of the hospitals are barely functioning, if functioning at all. Almost all of the clinics have been destroyed or forced to relocate. So staff, medical staff, are trying their best. And there's a generation of children that will never be the same. Because if anyone knows about the impact of malnutrition and the lack of adequate diet when you're young, that has a lifelong effect on you. So I share that just as my being there, and then I was there at Christmas time. There was an ecumenical delegation led primarily by churches from South Africa that said we have to go and express our support, our prayers at this time that's very important for Christians in the, sort of the life of our faith, with the people who are suffering. So we went to Jerusalem, we met to Bethlehem, we also went to Tel Aviv, we met with families that had loved ones that were being held hostage in Gaza. So we went down to the plaza there, the displays. We met with newly released prisoners and also families in Bethlehem and Jerusalem who had families in Gaza that they'd not been able to, maybe had gotten a text or something like that. So we tried to just express our presence and support. It seemed like a very small effort at that time, but none of us had any idea that now, 10 months later, the war and slaughter would still be going on. So I can't cover everything the UN's done, but our group of non-governmental organizations have been meeting almost weekly of NGOs here in New York that are working closely with the UN and working with folks on the ground in Israel and Palestine. So I'll try and summarize that a little bit and then hopefully open that up. That generates some questions. But perhaps the oldest, longest standing issue that the UN has been facing is the question of Palestine. And I pose it as the question of Palestine because when it was first introduced right after the UN was founded in 1945, Palestine was a British mandate. And the British were the colonial power that had been given a mandate from the League of Nations to be in charge there. And they decided they were going to leave. It's a good decision. So as they left, the UN had to figure out what to do. And I have some maps. I'm sorry, ideally I have a PowerPoint for this, but these are some of the maps that the UN drew up in 1946 to look at the population in each province of the British Mandate and also to look at land ownership. And out of these maps, they developed 181, the resolution, the General Assembly resolution, the partition plan that folks may have heard about, that was to create two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And so they've been dealing with it ever since. That was November 29th, 1947. They had 6 months, and so in May of 1948, Israel established itself and declared itself a state, and it has been a state ever since. There has yet to be a Palestinian state. Though Palestine is recognized an observer state at the UN. It's been able just this year to introduce resolutions. It's, as an observer, cannot vote. And so when the UN frames it, it talks about the question of Palestine. Why? Because Palestinian right to self-determination, one of the basic principles of the UN, that people should have a right to self-determination, has not yet been realized. And so there's a responsibility of the international community to address that. I won't go through all the history, but I do want to offer one set of dates and principles, of documents that were adopted in December of 1948. So December 10th is International Human Rights Day. Hopefully you'll be doing something here at Hofstra to celebrate and mark that day. December 10th was the day in 1948 that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified. The day before, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide was adopted and put out for countries to sign on to. And the day after that, on December 11th, the resolution, General Assembly Resolution 194 on the right of return for Palestinian refugees was adopted. So if you think about that in this context of a couple years after World War II, the UN body of member states had come together and three things happened. They adopted a convention saying genocide is terrible. We've learned some lessons, hopefully, from World War II. This should never happen again. And we have a convention to ensure that that does not happen again, and there are things we can do about it. And we have a universal declaration of human rights that we should lift up to the world and encourage member states and all parties and peoples to take part in. And we should recognize that there's been a massive displacement in the last year of Palestinians. 70% or more of Palestinians were displaced in the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe, at that time in 47 to 49. So it was still ongoing at that point. So to me, it's like that shows that the UN, the body, the member states at that time, much less, many of them were still colonial powers, had colonies across Africa. So, but they nevertheless recognized those three things of like genocide needs to be prevented and punished, human rights need to be lifted up, and we need to address the specific concerns of a specific group of Palestinian refugees that most recently, right now, have been displaced. And I share that because I'm going to talk a little bit about the International Court of Justice has had a number of rulings, some of you may have seen, where South Africa in particular has taken the lead and other member states have joined them in invoking the Convention of Genocide and charging the government of Israel as a member state and a signatory of the Convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide as engaging in genocide and calling for the International Court of Justice to have a ruling about that. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the different steps that have taken place at the Security Council, the General Assembly, and then we are in the US, it is an election season. I know you just had some things, so I hope to touch on a little bit about like, so what about US policy? And what can we, those of us who are US citizens and who are here in the United States, do about that? So a lot. So 1948 was those three things. I'll mention one other date and then I want to go right to the current thing, which is 1949. There was a series of 4 conventions, the Geneva Conventions, that were adopted, that were to say, like, what have we learned from the lessons of the horrors of World War II? And about protecting non-combatants, protecting prisoners of war is one of the conventions, protecting wounded who are no longer fighting and have like stopped being a combatant. So they're non-combatants also, they're not civilians. And it's just like this technical legal term. I'll try to kind of, like I'm not a lawyer, but I've done a lot of work on this and I know some of you might want to be lawyers or are lawyers, which is great, but we need to kind of engage folks. And then the protection of civilians in armed conflict. And those are things that the UN as a world body is still struggling with. So how does the UN kind of go about engaging this? And I want to offer a quick summary that I found, like my layperson's guide to UN activities, that the UN approaches most problems in the world with like a 4-step process. And here it's important like to understand the UN is a club. So it's like a club on the Hofstra has clubs. It's a club, and but to be a member, one of the requirements is to be a government. So you and I can't necessarily join, but through the US government, through the governments of other folks who are international students, there's 194 members of the UN, member states. And that's why those of us who are human rights organizations, churches, other faith groups are described negatively. We are NGOs, non-governmental organizations. You see how the priority is to governments? And from early on, non-governmental organizations or people's organizations said, you know what? War, human rights, economic and social development, that's too important to leave just to governments. We need to have a role, and the UN recognized that, and in the Charter, there are provisions for how the non-governmental organizations, civil society, people's organizations can be involved. So the 4 steps that I want to outline, and I think you will see how this has worked or not worked in the last year, in relation especially to Gaza. The first is to set standards. So we have like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have the Convention on Genocide. So the UN, is, I think over its 70-some years in existence, has done a decent job of getting governments to set standards around the world, like a convention on torture, convention eliminating racial discrimination, gender discrimination. But you don't set standards if there aren't some violations going on. So usually those standards are a barometer and a measurement of problems that the world is facing. So you need an implementation plan to get governments and others to come. So step 2 is let's develop a plan. And the UN has often developed plans of how to get from here to there on human rights, on climate, etc. The third is those plans won't work and those standards won't be upheld if we don't have a monitoring mechanism, including self-evaluation. So in all of the human rights treaties, there is a self-reporting mechanism that governments are supposed to report as signatories, and an independent monitoring capacity of special rapporteurs through the UN High Commission for Human Rights, but also folks like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other human rights groups can submit independent reports to show that, wait, if you ask the government, how are we doing? Most governments will say, well, we got a few problems, but basically we're one of the best governments on this issue, no problems. And the UN is candid enough to say, no, that's not the case. Let's hear more. And so the fourth step, and this is the important step, is enforcement. That when violations are named, what do you do? And so if you look at the International Court of Justice as a place to adjudicate disputes between states, and that's why South Africa brought a case at the end of December that was considered in January to the Court of Justice, charging the government of Israel with the crime of genocide. And the Convention on Genocide is something that I think is really important and helpful for us to look at compared to some other ones. It's not easy because it calls for both the prevention and the punishment. So punishment is illegal, like a trial engaged in a court. You have evidence. You prove, if someone is found guilty, then it's like, what's the appropriate punishment? But they recognize that you can't wait till after the fact with genocide. It's like with arson. If a building is on fire, do you wait until determining whether it was started intentionally as arson or it was an electrical short? Like, what happens first? We got to put the fire out. And so the preventive component of the Convention on Genocide is we can't wait. This is too urgent. We have to do something now. And that's what South Africa was saying. We've seen massive slaughter and displacement that have been happening from October through December. We can't wait. And in fact, the International Court of Justice issued 3 provisional orders in January, again in March, and again in May. And in each of those provisional orders, it demanded actions by the government of Israel to stop any actions that could contribute to plausible genocide. So this is legalese, but what they were saying was like, look, we don't know. A court of law will need to determine for sure if this is actually the crime of genocide, but there's enough urgency here, there's enough lives that have been lost and displaced that we have to act at the moment to make sure no more harm is done. It's a kind of like harm reduction, sort of stopping harm approach. And I think that's really important to say, that they have not said per se, and there's still a process that's going forward of submitting evidence and moving towards a potential trial in the International Court of Justice. You may have seen separately the International Criminal Court, and I won't say a lot about that, but I'd be happy to answer some questions about that. The International Criminal Court is much more recent. It was generated from discussions in the 1990s and adopted around 98, 2000, and it's to try individuals. So what they recognized was the International Court of Justice was set up state-to-state disputes. So the state of South Africa challenging the state of Israel. But what about individuals? What about individual responsibility? And this goes back to like Nuremberg and the responsibilities that like whatever orders one might be given, if they're unjust orders, you have an individual responsibility. And so that's where there have been a request for warrants for several of the Hamas leaders and also for several of the Israeli leaders, Netanyahu and Gallant, I forget all the different folks. That's in process as well, but that's a separate process around individuals. So there have been many meetings, like, let me just say, the UN does tend to meet. When in doubt, if they can't come to agreement, they agree to meet. So, like, I think, like, at the UN, it feels like every day is a dialogue day. And, when people's lives are on the line, when there was the horrendous attacks on October 7th, where civilians were hit, also military. Again, it's like lives were lost. And I think as a faith community, as human rights organizations, we need to be cognizant that all lives are sacred. So when lives are lost, something has gone wrong. And we should acknowledge that. The UN has this kind of, a still also legal component, so they kind of separate out non-combatants, combatants, civilians. There's different categories. But still, we need to understand, all of the loss of life is a tragedy and a failure of the multilateral system and of the member governments to fully address the disputes instead of gathering around a table to do that. So I want to look at the Convention of Genocide quickly. There's 5 criteria, and the convention, you can find this online, but I'll just summarize the criteria. The convention says if any one of these 5 is present, then there is genocide occurring, and it needs to be prevented and at the appropriate time punished. So the first is killing of members of a group. So has there been killing where people were killed because they were Palestinian? Second is the causing of bodily harm or mental harm to members of a particular group. So has there been bodily and mental harm imposed on Palestinians? The third is to create the physical conditions that lead to the destruction of part or all of a particular ethnic, racial, religious group. So have there been conditions created in Gaza that have made it unlivable for Palestinians? And the fourth is the intent to prevent births of children in that in a particular group. In Gaza, there are roughly 180 women that give birth every day, and that's been since October 7th and before. So there are thousands of young children that, without adequate nutrition, without access to medical care, that without any clean drinking water, without waste disposal, with one toilet for 4,000 to 10,000 or more people, when there's not running water, by the way, for that toilet, with inadequate food, with lack of aid. Is there an intent to prevent births? These are questions. And so the fifth is the transfer of children from a member group, a particular group, to another group. And we certainly saw that in the situation of Ukraine and Russia. And so they were accused of these terms. We're not going to talk about Russia, Ukraine, or Sudan, or some of the other conflicts, but I do want to say that these things are applied in a variety of ways. The Genocide Convention is also interesting because it's one of the conventions that the state of Israel, like the state of South Africa, have both signed on to completely. I mean, the U.S. government has as well. The U.S., however, has signed with some reservations, saying we don't actually accept the Convention of the Genocide being applied to us. So we take a reservation on the capacity of member states to bring the U.S. before the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. That's just a little aside. But certainly I would argue, and I think what the International Court of Justice found, was that 4 of those 5 criteria of killing members of a group, causing bodily and mental harm, creating physical conditions that make life unlivable for members of a group, and the intent to prevent births or births. Certainly those 4, there is ample evidence that that's happening. Now, there's a lot of questions about why, but again, with this framework of prevention, what I want to argue is that we need to prevent that. If that's happening, or might be happening, we need to stop it. And so the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, issued these orders in January and mandated that Israel report on how it's complying. Now, this is where, remember I said there were 4 steps, and that 4th step was enforcement? The weakest link in the UN system is enforcement is dependent upon its member states to do. So the UN does not have its own army. It does not have its own unarmed civilian protection force either. It has to create things to challenge, to sort of deal with the enforcement. And that's where like the Security Council comes in. And the US, as folks may recall, vetoed a number of resolutions. The Security Council was not able to adopt a resolution around the situation in Gaza, and I'll also talk a little bit about the West Bank, until March of this year. From October 2023 till March, the Biden administration repeatedly vetoed Security Council resolutions and said it was not time yet for a ceasefire. So when you look at the charges and what South Africa brought in terms of the crime of genocide and preventing genocide, the US government's position was not yet. There's not been enough killing yet. That has been the Biden administration policy. In March, it did not call for a permanent ceasefire, despite an amazing mobilization of member states and global grassroots movements to call for a ceasefire that was an immediate ceasefire, a full ceasefire with unhindered humanitarian access. And one humanitarian organization after another said, we can't get aid in if there's still fighting going on. So a ceasefire is necessary to do the work of the humanitarian work that doesn't take sides but just addresses need. And the ceasefire that the U.S. finally abstained on in March was for Ramadan, and it was adopted halfway through Ramadan. So it was, at best, if it was implemented, would have been a 2-week ceasefire. So we need to understand that the role of the U.S. government has been, in my humble opinion, and I think in the opinion of the world, horrendous. It has been actively aiding and abetting the crime of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Gaza and in the West Bank. And now it's happening in Lebanon as well. So a couple more things. What's been the U.S. role? Let me just touch on that briefly because I want to allow most of the time for discussion. Since October a year ago, the Biden administration has approved over 500 arms sales to Israel. And Congress has approved, and the White House has signed, billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. It also cut off funding to the UN Relief Works Agency, which is the primary humanitarian organization serving the Palestinian people in Gaza. It's the second largest employer in Gaza and the West Bank after the Palestinian Authority. So we've cut off, the US government has cut off aid and humanitarian aid and said it's not time for a ceasefire, and we want to ship more weapons to a government that has been found to be ordered under international law to stop. Again, it doesn't sort out all the, I don't want, there's aspects of like what did happen on October 7th. There were crimes that happened on October 7th against Israeli civilians. But the UN has the Israeli government has blocked international bodies to come in to investigate to find out what really happened. So we can't even have actual accountability around what happened on October 7th because the Israeli government will not let the Commission of Inquiry, it will not yet let UN staff in. Now, a couple more things I'll say, and then I really want to see. So for the US, what's needed right now? There's been, I think, a massive mobilization on campuses. Certainly, I think your campus has had activism, but like campuses across the country. I was in South Africa for a conference on apartheid in May. And at that point, campuses across the United States had been erupting. There were several campuses, it's the Southern Hemisphere, so they have a different schedule. So that was kind of moving into winter at that point. And that was the fall semester in May. So they just got back on campus. They were inspired by Columbia University, by University of Michigan, by other campuses to say, you know what, we're going to have an encampment. I visited one of the encampments when I was there. And the campus police were meeting with some of the encampment folks. This is just a little aside. And they said, now look, you're in this common space here, that's fine. And you've got little pup tents here. And, like we've arranged, there was a couple of groups that had requested to use this space. We found other alternative venues for them, so you can stay here. But you've got this really big tent that, like, you need a permit for the tent. So the office you need to go to is the building's office, and they will help you see whether you can get a permit or not to have this big tent, which had been donated by Muslim organizations in Johannesburg to the students. And so to me, it was like, well, this is an interesting notion. So I'll leave it to you to discuss campus dynamics. But here was an administration working with students to say there's a protest. We need to kind of figure out what's an appropriate way to keep everybody safe and to engage in public discourse about a crucial issue in our world. Now, what can we do? There's been this massive movement. There have been more calls around Palestine, around a ceasefire, to members of Congress than ever before. And Congress is not listening. The White House is not listening. So I think this creates a real political crisis for member states, and that's true in other states, but not nearly, in Europe and other places. There's much more of a sense of we need to get a ceasefire. So the U.S. is very isolated in the UN. France, the UK, and others, United Kingdom, that are former colonial powers, are nevertheless saying, the humanitarian situation is so urgent, we need to do more. So I think the calls are for an immediate ceasefire, for full humanitarian access, and arms embargo or an arms restriction. And here's an interesting point that I welcome, thoughts, and that humanitarian organizations that normally don't weigh in about political issues are saying, without an arms embargo and without a ceasefire, we cannot address the healthcare needs like the polio vaccination. There was the polio vaccination that happened last month and again the last week or so shows that there can be humanitarian pauses. That's not a ceasefire, but they were able to vaccinate 600, 700,000 children under the age of 10, which meant also that those children had to be able to get to and connect with healthcare providers safely. They've been able to do the second dose, which happens about a month later, in southern Gaza and in central Gaza, but they've not been able to do it in northern Gaza because of the latest policy. And here I'll just say it's a real challenge. The Israeli government officials have said that everyone needs to evacuate yet again, and this is like the third, 10th evacuation from northern Gaza, or we will starve the entire population. That's over 400,000 people. Starvation is a war crime when it's used in a conflict situation. Now, sadly, we don't have as strong a preventive component in our other human rights instruments the way we have with genocide. To say, we shouldn't have to wait till starvation happens to say that this is a war crime. And so there are human rights experts, there are activists, there are members of governments that are saying we need to stop this. And yet it's been the US and Germany to some degree that have really been blocking things at the UN from stronger implementation of a ceasefire that would enable. One last thing I'll just say is, two last things. September, after a year, the Biden administration has said that they have been trying 24/7 to get more aid in and to get a ceasefire and to release the hostages. Now, when they say hostages, I would invite us to talk about detainees. There are, 100, people use the term 100 now, a number 100 now, of Israeli hostages held, although the sense is that probably 60 to 70 are still alive. There's at least 30 that are bodies that are being detained. This is like a sad, horrific thing that even bodies are seen as like a negotiating tool. But there are over 9,000 Palestinians that have been arrested since October a year ago, many without charge. they've been taken out of their homes in the middle of the night from the West Bank, some from Gaza. Palestinian healthcare workers in hospitals have been seized when the Israeli military came into the hospitals, detained, tortured. There's been documentation of this, and then released weeks or months later. So we need to look at like release all. And when I met with families in Tel Aviv, they were like, at December, they were like, all for all. Release all the captives being held in Gaza, and we need to release the Palestinians. They understood that, like, for the well-being and preserving life, we need to make some compromises politically to put life first. So we need to release all the captives, and we need this arms embargo. We need diplomatic and trade sanctions. And the UN is calling for that now through the General Assembly resolution from September. And I can say more about that resolution. But the last thing I want to say is, I think we need to challenge the US government and the world around the whole notion of terrorism, that there is a foreign terrorist organization list. Because in every single instance when a hospital has been attacked, in Gaza most recently, but also in Syria in the 10-plus year civil war, in Ukraine, when a hospital is attacked, the attackers say there was a terrorist in that hospital, and therefore it was okay. So the terrorism framework that we use, that there are absolute bad guys, and we are good guys, has to be challenged. That is a tough, tough challenge, but it has to be challenged. To say that some folks we won't even talk to, because if you're on the foreign terrorist organization list, the US government is not supposed to talk directly to them. So it cuts off dialogue. Shouldn't we, like, think about this? Like, if we've got deep-seated problems in the world, isn't it the folks we hate the most, that we're most at odds with, are the very people we should say, you know, let's try it. It may not work. And in fact, there have been some conversations. Israel has talked with Hamas leadership. They've now killed quite a few of those leaders. So I invite us to say, like, what can, like we do, and hopefully this will lead into discussion about, to take up that challenge of sort of reframing it from terrorism to putting people's lives first and putting equal rights for all. And to say, you know, like, how can we save non-combatants? Last little anecdote. I was in the West Bank a number of years ago, and pastor there, Palestinian Christian leader, he says, you know, I think we've misunderstood the whole two-state solution that the UN has. It was a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. I think we need two states, but we need one state for the extremists of all sides, and then we need one state for the rest of us so we can live together. And so I offer that as kind of a thought. Sometimes humor gets to the truth quicker than all the analysis of what would it take for us to re-envision not only the Middle East, not only Palestine and Israel, but our own way of engaging on the toughest issues that divide us, to say that we should give priority to dialogue. We not compromise on our principles, but to say, you know, we're going to listen, and we also ask you to listen with respect. So in that spirit, I hope we have plenty of time for discussion, dialogue, and thank you all so much for being here, and I welcome questions and comments.
So we'll open things up for that discussion and dialogue. I think this mic is working, so if you want to line up and share your comments or questions or insights in the spirit that we have heard about, the spirit of respect and learning and dialogue. I appreciate that.
I just want to start off by saying thank you. Thank you for sharing everything that you know and that you've seen, because a lot of people aren't getting the facts, and that's a big issue, because how are you supposed to understand reality without the facts? First off, I want to say that what's happening in Gaza, in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, this is not a vacuum. It's affecting us. It's affecting us now. It's been affecting us. I have a 9-month-old article from The Guardian talking about how emissions from Israel's war in Gaza have immense effect on the climate catastrophe. That was 9 months ago. It's only escalated since then. And we just saw in our own country, there's hurricanes happening, displacing so many people. People are dying. We don't have the infrastructure to get them away from these places and from this destruction. We're seeing our own country, instead of addressing our needs with the climate, with the genocide going on, with wars going on in the world, instead we're focusing on militarization. Instead we're focusing on fracking, destroying our environment more. We're not focused on a future right now, and that's a bipartisan effort. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And as you said, this is the Biden administration's genocide. This is fully sanctioned by them. Every single member that's been speaking, at least so far, that's been televised so far. But I think we also need to acknowledge that what's happening in Gaza, there's some 800,000 tons of rubble that is most likely infected with asbestos. And we know, we're New Yorkers, some of us, I'm a New Yorker, 9/11, I mean, we still have people dying from it. These are people that came in there and saved lives, and they're dying from that. And we have the situation where it's almost every single day for over a year. It's been like 9/11. I'm watching it, and I'm seeing the parallels, and I've been educated on this since I was a kid, and it's horrific, honestly. It's terrifying. But I think we need to acknowledge that if we don't stop this right now, it's going to end the world. And I don't want to say that to be fear-mongering. I say that because we have the facts. We have the climate clock. It's ticking down. I'm a sustainability major. I don't know if I mentioned that. So this is my whole career. And it's everything that everyone needs to be focused on. Everyone needs to understand this. Everyone needs to understand how it impacts us. And everyone needs to make a decision come November. Are we going to support this? I mean, we had, at the DNC, we had people, I think it was Muslim Women for Harris. They wanted to have a Palestinian speaker. That was not granted. There was a little panel held that was historic on Palestinian human rights, and it was incredible. And watching that was incredible. But also, it wasn't on the stage. This is impacting all of us. How is something that's our tax money is going towards on the stage? Like, we have so many issues. We need to wake up. I think we really need to wake up. We need to understand that we shouldn't be focusing on sending our money towards destruction. We should be focusing on building and rebuilding, because our own country is getting destroyed. So, yeah, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. That's why don't we'll take like 3 questions, since I see 3 folks standing. So then I'll try and respond.
Now, is it like 3 questions per person, 3 questions in total?
Yeah. Well, hopefully, like I'll. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So my entire thing is just, I'd rather just America just focus on America. I'm tired of it being like the world police. And it's just like, really, do we need to send billions to Ukraine, billions to Israel? Do we need to help transgender people in Pakistan for some reason? Does my tax dollars really need to go to that? It just feels like so much bloated shit that they just put in these bills for these globalist reasons that I can't understand. And also, I have no idea why it's just like constant ceasefire with Hamas when literally Israel's on the precipice of victory. The war is almost over. The leadership of Hamas is down. Hezbollah is down. Iran has failed to really do a dent to Israel with its multiple rocket launch attackers at this point, all shot down. So basically, why not just take the win and have our ally win the war completely, instead of just endlessly ceasefiring and just wait for, I don't know, round 500 at this point, as there have been like 7 wars at this point? I mean, I just don't understand it, like, in general. It's just like, just take the win. I mean, it's bad. I mean, we can help the people after the war, but during the war, it is not going to really be that good. And South Africa's it's like crumbling right now. It's not even going to be around like 10 years probably. Like the economy in South Africa, down. Everything is down. Education is down. It's not even going to be around by then. Or really, if it's going to be around, it's not going to be really, it's not going to be like functioning that around. And the UN has just been sitting around doing nothing, as it's just a useless entity entirety. It's just like, oh no, Kamala Harris and Trump are really going to have to worry about what the UN has to say. Oh, Xi Jinping's really going to stop everything they're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was something. I also think, and I know this is going to sound like it first, but just hear me out. I think there needs to be a conversation on how Israel has been allowed to get away with this, because they have like a very effective rhetorical strategy of like basically just like painting anyone who like criticizes them in their actions as is just, oh, well, you're sympathizing with terrorists, or you hate Jewish people. Why are you against our existence? I'm not fundamentally against like the existence of the state of Israel. I'm just against like the like massacre of like over 100,000 children. There's nothing anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas about like my stance that like children shouldn't be getting like carpet bombed. But unfortunately, like Benjamin Netanyahu, a lot of the politicians in the United States and basically the entire mainstream media like perpetuates this blatant lie that if you criticize that like if you're against what the state of Israel is doing in this war, then oh, you're an anti-Semite and you're not worth listening to. I think the best way to combat this claim, I feel like, is to just like platform like Jewish anti-Zionists, because I've already I've listened to like a lot of their voices. Like obviously there's Jewish Voice for Peace, which is like one of the largest pro-Palestine groups. I think we need to not only get more like just general pro-Palestine voices, but like more pro-Palestine voices from the Jewish community specifically to like debunk Israel's main claim that like we are that kind of like Israel is like Judaism, Zionism is Judaism. That's a completely nonsensical claim, and I think that's what we need to challenge, because that's their most effective propaganda tool, basically.
Thank you. All right. So,
Hi. I just had a quick question. Maybe you can provide, some insight into my question. I'm no expert on the Israel-Palestine, the history of the conflict. However, recently, because of the conflict, I have been able to gain more insight into it, read into it, actually learn some things about how things have gotten to this point. This is all to say that, the October 7th attack was obviously horrible, and the actions committed by those people, by Hamas, were horrible. And so, up until recently, I did kind of understand why Israel wanted to go so hard after Hamas and took such a hard stand. But when I saw them invade Lebanon and displace millions of people in chase of a terrorist organization that isn't in Lebanon, it's not really connected to Lebanon, to me that was a changing point in this war. And it became less of a war against Hamas and more of Israel seeking its opportunity to get something done that they may have wanted to get done for a long time. And I don't want to allude to what that is, but what I'm asking for an insight is, how does the UN and other organizations like the UN show that there is a change that's occurring and this war is now turning into an opportunity?
great. Yeah, that's a big question. All right. Let's do. Yeah, so I know others have some questions, but I'll try and quickly address some of these so I don't lose things that people shared. So, yeah, thank you to the first person about climate issues. I mean, I think war is really bad for the climate. Let's just be clear. Like, the largest user of fossil fuels in the United States is the U.S. military. It's the largest user of it. And so if you extrapolate that to other places, that's true in many countries, that the military often uses it and often do not abide by the same regulations. In terms of climate and environmental regulations, Israel has some strong environmental regulations. They exempt the settlements, which are all illegal under international law in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, from any of the Israeli laws around emissions. So there's dumping from settlements that go down. The settlements are usually up on the hills. So there's a lot of toxic dumping that happens onto Palestinian villages that are in the wadi or the valleys down below. When you cut off electricity, you cut off the sewage treatment plant, which means sewage is going directly out into the Mediterranean, and that drifts and affects the shoreline, the entire shoreline. So I think, like, you made an excellent point. We need to look at the climate impact of war and the fact that more and more wars are focusing on resource control. So a lot of the wars in the Middle East have been seen, it's about oil. Well, there are natural gas fields that are off the coast of Gaza and off the coast of Israel that are being exploited. Chevron is one of the companies, and there's actually a boycott of Chevron campaign because of Chevron's involvement with contracts to say, stop the contracts there. There's a larger issue about, like, should we just leave things in the ground? But I think it's important to look at what's sustainable. And clearly, war is not sustainable. And what I want to sort of challenge us to think about here in this regard is we've perfected and improved our media access to information. So we can get what would have taken weeks beforehand to get stories from Gaza. People are able to use solar power and charge their phones. And, I visited like a solar power construction facility in Gaza. It was fascinating. And so they found very creative ways to get information out instantly. War, destroying buildings, happens very quickly. But the work of peace, the work of development, the work of equal rights is very slow work. It doesn't happen overnight. And so I think the other thing that's happened with Gaza is it's a Mediterranean location. It's beautiful. If there was no conflict, it's an agricultural setting, but most of the agricultural land in Gaza before October 7th last year was declared a closed military zone. So farmers had to risk their lives to potentially harvest their crops. The policies of a 17-year blockade on Gaza, which was before October 7th last year, created an aid-dependent society where 2.3 million people had to depend on aid, which means if the aid's cut off, you can't just go out to your backyard and say, well, I've got the vegetable garden out here, at least there's some access here. They have a little bit of that, but they've been forced to depend on aid. And so if you look at the climate thing, it's like the destruction of agricultural. In southern Lebanon, white phosphorus has been used, and that poisons the land, so it's making a lot of the places, even if it thankfully doesn't harm individuals for much of that bombing, it makes the land unusable for agriculture. So this is absolutely, we should do sustainable checks on all these things and force the Pentagon to have a sustainability accountability. So anyways, I forget where you are, but anyways, your major is great and we need more. So just keep at it. In terms of the second, right now, one of the most amazing life-saving things the U.S. could do is to do nothing about the Middle East. Stop the arms sales. So I thank you for saying about America, stop the arms shipments. But there is some movie from a long time ago that was Show Me the Money, follow the money. There was a director of agriculture for the state of Texas years ago who said, money is like manure. You spread it around and you can kind of fertilize everything, lots of stuff grows, but too much of it in one place stinks. And that's one of the problems, is I think a lot of people in the United States would love to say, let's let people sort things out. But we're not letting people sort things out. We're providing billions of dollars of weapons. We have U.S. troops on the ground in Israel today. We have aircraft carriers that don't move real quick, that are in range of missiles and drones. We are escalating. There's already a regional war that's been going on for a year. But it's been a war largely waged by Israel and the United States. And the U.S. is saying, well, we don't want anybody else to be involved in that war. So isolation and addressing and redirecting funds to meet the needs of the communities, and there's a variety of ways. That's not today's topic. Absolutely. So I want to thank you for raising that. I think, one of the sort of religious principles is, am I my neighbor's keeper? And do unto others as you would want them to do. So whatever the situation in a country, and that's one of the lessons from the South African leadership is, they've got a lot of problems in South Africa, but they were like, you know what, we were in harm's way. We were suffering under a system of apartheid and racial discrimination for decades. And we needed the world to pay attention and come to our aid. We needed others. And in the same way, I think what Palestinians are saying is we need others, and Israeli human rights activists that are active in nonviolent accompaniment on the West Bank as they're able, that are challenging their own government. It's a small group. Need others to intervene, but intervening isn't always military. Why do we always see intervening as only military and not? I have a friend who's here from the West Bank, from near Bethlehem, and she's meeting with folks at the UN about proposing unarmed civilian protection. To say, you know what, we don't need armed peacekeepers. What we need is people that are well-trained to de-escalate, to be in strategic places, to kind of, when things are happening, you can kind of talk to folks, talk them down. I would say that's a great model for campuses, college communities, how do we encourage nonviolent training in de-escalation and de-confliction to sort of separate folks out as they need. So thank you for raising those questions. Third, yes, absolutely. There's a narrative in the United States and mainstream media has been convenient. I also just want to say that one of the strongest pro-Israel groups are Christian Zionists, that oftentimes, there's this charge of anti-Semitism. Many of the Christian Zionists are pretty anti-Semitic, but they see Israel as a tool in their theological agenda of how to run the world. It's a mess. That could be a whole thing. We could discuss that tomorrow, maybe. But seriously, I think we should always examine those things. And that's why at the end, I urged us to rethink the terrorism narrative, because folks with power have said, it's terrorists versus good guys, rather than there's good conduct that upholds human rights and there's bad conduct that targets and demonizes others. So an apartheid system is when you have two sets of rules. Well, in effect, look at the war on terrorism. If you're a terrorist, then if we bomb the hospital, if we bomb a school, it's in the name of fighting terrorism, so it must be okay. And so we need to challenge that apartheid language that divides us, to say there's, and for the U.S., the conquering of the West, the image of the cowboys and the Indians, good guys and bad guys, instead of targeting people, hate speech, racism, whoever's doing it, to whoever they're doing it, needs to be challenged and condemned. And so I think that you're absolutely right. And just 2 days ago, there was a group of Hasidic Jews outside, across the street from the Israeli mission and Israeli consulate in New York, protesting to say that Zionism is anti-Semitism. These are very conservative. I think on some issues I would not agree with them at all. But here were Jews expressing their voice that are very different than Jewish Voice for Peace, that's often secular, seen as more progressive politically on a lot of issues. But the point is that the Jewish community is diverse, the Palestinian community is diverse. We in the United States are pretty diverse. We should also not say that the Muslim community. And related to this, I would say that it's really important that there's been some folks who, when anti-Semitism is raised, then they say, of course, we're also opposed to Islamophobia. But what's invisible is the specific suffering Palestinians have faced, not because they're Muslim, not because they're Arab, but because they're Palestinian. And so we need to talk, I would urge you all to talk more and more about what are the dynamics of anti-Palestinian racism that are happening, that a Palestinian voice could not be heard at the Democratic National Convention. Shame on the leaders who wouldn't even listen to somebody, like the cut-off dialogue. But to name it more specifically and say this is something that needs to be lifted up. And thank you for the last question you're raising about Lebanon as well. I also think, this is a code word that I've learned from way too many conversations with folks with power. And it's like the first thing they say after I say, this is urgent, we need a ceasefire, we need to stop the military arms, etc. Well, it's complicated. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's not killing people is not complicated, it's wrong. Bombing hospitals is not complicated, it's wrong. Now stopping it, we've learned this past year, is hard work. So you can say to members of Congress, look, if you don't want to work, just tell me. You're lazy. You want your paycheck and you don't want to do anything. Okay, I'll think about that when I go into the voting booth. But don't tell me it's complicated. It's hard work. And we need to force write letters to the editor. Now we have the opportunity through social media to make our own media, rather than waiting for the mainstream media. And what's happened is there's a gap between those who get their news from mainstream media and those who are getting it directly from folks that are on the ground. And some of that on the ground is like Israeli soldiers showing really offensive stuff about lording over buildings they've destroyed. So it's not only coming from Palestinian sources, it's coming from Israeli sources themselves that are now, we're these guys are ants, they're vermin, it's horrendous stuff. And if folks know Hebrew and are able, look at the translations, it's quite offensive, some of that. So anyway, thank you. But how do we address that? Stay on message. So when folks try and distract you about anti-Semitism or anything, it's anti-Semitism is wrong. But the discrimination and racism that Palestinians are facing right now has to be addressed. So now you've acknowledged the important thing of anti-Semitism, but you also have stayed on message. So the same with Lebanon, it's there might be problems there, but bombing whole communities, displacing 20% of this, think about it. There are 8 universities in Gaza, like Hofstra here. Every single one of them has been flattened. I visited Islamic University a couple of years ago, had 20,000 students. Half of those students were women. That university's gone. Those students are having to figure out how to get some kind of education as well as just survive. So to evacuate 25% of Lebanon, to say, we just move, because there's allegedly 1 or 2 terrorists that are here, if you break it down, just stay on message of what are we doing here? So just stay on message, follow the money, and focus on actions that are wrong, not groups and identity-based stuff. So we've got a couple more questions, and I know we're running out of time, so please, or comments.
I'll make it quick. I just wanted to ask, because it was brought up a couple of times in terms of what you said about Israel not really letting independent groups like UN agencies come in to investigate what has happened, and sort of a lot of the narratives, especially in the media and just general discourse about what's going on over there. My main question and concern is, especially going back to all the reactions to World War II and what that led to, how are we going to possibly educate people about these events in the next decade or few decades with how little is being revealed to us even in the present day, and how without that information we're already so divided and agendas have already been formed that even reject the facts that do come out of the situation. And so I sort of was wondering about that. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. Did you have? Yeah, no. Let's see. Yeah.
I know we're out of time, and the gentleman who started this conversation said that he was sorry that he couldn't get an opposing point of view, but maybe there'd be some discussion later. So hopefully we can have a discussion. So I'll try to be brief, but I will point out.
It's really important because we try to give priority to tuition-paying students.
Right.
So please be brief. Yes.
Okay. Well. You know, in 1948, the UN created Israel as a homeland for Jews who were displaced from all over Europe because of the Holocaust. That's how Israel came to be, okay? And it makes sense because the Jews have been there for 5,000 years. So what happened to the Palestinians? They carved out a tiny little piece of the area and they call it Israel, okay? The Palestinians could have gone to Jordan or Egypt or whatever, but I believe they were just there as pawns because the situation hasn't been solved in 50 years. Israel does not go to war with anybody. Every conflict that has been in the Middle East is because Israel was invaded. They were invaded in 1948 when Israel was formed. The Arabs invaded Israel from all over, okay? In 1967, during the holiest day of the year, the Arabs invaded Israel. They've invaded Israel all the time. You sit up there and you say the United States is Satan, it's terrible, we're giving all this money to Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the area. If Israel falls, then that's just a domino and we're next, okay? Your point of view is all skewed. So I'm just here to tell everybody that Israel doesn't make war, and then you go on to say about genocide, and you tell me the 5 things about genocide. Genocide was Hitler killing 6 million people, many of them Jews. He did it on purpose and he planned it. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, we went to Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda. Nobody said anything about it. And then last year, when 1,200 people in Israel were murdered and massacred, women and children, from terrorists who came over from Gaza, and Israel goes over there, the world says, oh, what are you doing? You're starting another war. So I would just like to show you that there are 2 sides to the story there, and Israel is the most humanitarian country in the world. Whenever there was an earthquake in Japan, when there was a tsunami, Israel sent people. They send money, supplies, and medical to everybody all over the world, whether they're Jewish or not. So characterizing Israel the way you do, I think, gives everybody a disservice, okay? I said I would, that's it. So that's the opposing point of view.
But again, we really try to prioritize students.
I waited to the end.
No, he was, yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the,
You have a responsibility in Hofstra to present students with 2 points of view. Don't come up and say, I couldn't find anybody with a different point of view. I've been to lectures for the last few weeks all over. It's the same thing. Bash the U.S. and bash Israel, and it's the problem. That's not true. Don't go out of here thinking that Israel is terrible. You need to understand the facts. And this gentleman may have gone to Israel, but your facts are not true, and you say things that are not true, and it's all biased, okay? So that's why it's important for me to speak. So everybody hears 2 points of view. That's what America is about. That's what this lady, she created this, Cindy Bogart. If she was here today, she would puke listening to what's going on. It's not a discussion.
all right, thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm going to sit down, and I won't say another word.
Thank you. Yeah, let me take the first one about education. I mean, I think like education is a vocation, not a 4-year degree. There needs to be lifelong learning, and so I really affirm that's not easy. We need to all keep learning, and we're so divided. I would challenge us to say, how many of us have had conversations? Some of it's family members. I mean, I know people have had these conversations, but to think about, what does it take to have a conversation when we can't even agree on facts? Now we've said I stand by all the facts that I put out there. They're well documented. There are dozens and dozens of sources for everything that I said. And I apologize, I don't want to kind of out-footnote folks, but I want to hear that there's not one view on an issue. And so can we distinguish between, we have radically different senses of what's happening right now. But right before the U.S. invaded Iraq, and by the way, I was out on the streets protesting several days after 9/11. I saw the towers come down. And I said, you know what? This is going to lead to war, and more innocent people are going to die. And I worked with a group that was created on Valentine's Day in 2002 called Families of 9/11 Victims for Peaceful Tomorrows. And they used a quote from Martin Luther King. And they said, we lost loved ones. We do not want Afghan families to suffer the same, or anyone to suffer the same loss we had. We want justice done, and there's other ways of achieving justice for a wrong that's been done, like the crime of 9/11 or the crime of October 7th. There are other ways of addressing that than mass war. And so I think one can challenge and say that war is not the answer. I mean, that was the slogan, and we had peaceful vigils on September 15th, 2001, in October of 2001. In October of 2002, as we were getting ready as the US to go to war and invade Iraq, allegedly to address weapons of mass destruction, which resulted in several $1 trillion of wasted money and hundreds of thousands of lives lost and destroyed. I was doing a presentation like this at a church in New Jersey, and I said, look, don't talk to your friends. But if there's somebody that you disagree with, that you're really upset with their view, and I'd had someone raise why we need to go in and take out Saddam Hussein, and others who were had been doing civil disobedience themselves on other issues. And so I said, look, if we can't talk to one another now, after a gathering and a dialogue, what hope do we have? Well, the guy who had done multiple civil disobediences at the World Bank and protesting on one thing after another, and it was anti-US government, and the guy who was like, we need to tragically take out Saddam Hussein, and started talking at the little coffee hour afterwards. An hour later, they were still talking to one another in the parking lot. And they were like, have you read this? You should read this. And the other person said, well, what about this? Have you seen this website? And to me, that's the hard work of dialogue, is being willing to read and listen to the sources of others. Now, what I've shared here is widely accessible at the UN. It is widely accessible in social media, but it is not widely accessible in US mainstream media. There are members of Congress that lift this up. Barbara Lee, in 2001, was the only one. And this is where I would challenge us to say, never take silence in the face of wrong as the option. Martin Luther King, when he spoke out against the Vietnam War, entitled his sermon, Breaking the Silence. And so I think that speaking up, so I want to thank you for speaking up. I know we disagree. I hope there's ways that we can have conversations. But if we can't talk, what hope is it that the Israeli government, that Hamas or others are able to talk to one another? We need to really push, and I want to say seriously, but also talking means listening. And so I'm not sure that that's always happened. I see we have one last one. Can we take your comment quickly?
Yes.
Question? And then we'll...
Well, my question is just how can we engage in that productive dialogue when we are engaging with people who deny the straight up facts when we present them? So it's just a genuine question. How is that possible to have productive dialogue?
Great. It's not easy. Yeah, and so let me just say that I have learned something from Palestinian community of the Arabic word samud, which is steadfastness. And someone earlier was like, Israel's on the precipice of victory. Killing a lot of leaders does not kill a dream. It does not kill a movement. But engaging with folks, there are others who are like, if you even talk with the enemy, that's normalization. So we shouldn't engage. And I want to say that we need to engage. We need to be always respectful and never dehumanize anyone, including our enemy. I mean, Christians are told we love our enemies, and we do an awful job at that, let me just say. But part of loving your enemy, and this is something I learned from Palestinian Christians, was if you love your enemy, you cannot do them harm, but you also cannot allow them to continue doing harm to others. And so you have to engage them somehow, creatively, nonviolently, to challenge. And now I'll tell you, to lift up nonviolence right now is really hard. But it's too simplistic to either embrace the war on terrorism and the need to kind of stop terrorist groups which are really struggling for people's rights being denied, or to embrace armed struggle as the only answer. I mean, that is a problem. And that's happened in the student movement. Talking to my South African friends that were reflecting on years of struggle, they said, we always had different parts. There was non-cooperation, boycotts, divestment, sanctions, there was the armed struggle, but there was also international solidarity. And they said we need to understand never to lose one of those. Now, I would invite us to say, what is the framework for international solidarity? And so we need to talk with folks, also allies and new friends, like in other words, not just the friends in my own community that I know about, but reach out to other communities. But we need to try and, I think, push the edges and talk to folks that disagree if there's an agreement to be respectful and to listen to one another. That's slow work. And when the house is burning down, when lives have been lost, when I know many folks who've lost 10, 20, 50 members of their families. Like, how do I tell them that, we should sit down and talk about this? Like, that has to stop. So I get, the urgency. And I think we need to have both hold that urgency in tension with, what being in it for the long haul. So with that, I know we're running out of time. So, but thank you all for hanging in there. I want to thank everybody who's here, because that's part of modeling dialogue and being in it, both for the emergency right now and for the long haul. So,
Thank you.
thank you.